the golden haze of a Victorian morning, that is, foggy and entirely dependent on how recently the chimney sweep visited, a young bride prepared for her wedding day. She stood in her bedroom, which smelled faintly of starch and lavender, trembling not with joy, but with the slow realization that tonight she'd be expected to do something rather mysterious, potentially scandalous, and almost certainly never discussed at afternoon tea. Victorian brides weren't terrified of their wedding night because they feared being unloved. No, they were afraid because no one would simply explain what, precisely, was meant to happen after the last clink of the teaspoons and the final button of the corset was undone. You see, in mid-19th century England, a proper girl of good breeding was expected to know as little as possible about anything remotely biological. The education system was quite thorough in this respect. A woman might learn French, embroidery, and the finer points of melon balustrade etiquette. But reproductive knowledge was treated as if it were a contagious fever. Highly improper and best left entirely undiscussed. And so our fictional bride, let's call her Miss Clara Hopestill, approached her wedding night not with curiosity, but with a hollow mix of dread and sheer confusion. She had vague impressions, distorted by whispers, embroidery circles, and accidental glances in very old art books, that something was supposed to happen, something immensely important. And yet the details remained suspiciously absent, as if passed through generations via interpretive dance and charades. The older married women at the bridal shower had told her she would understand in time, but Clara had hoped to understand well in advance. Her mother, Lady Hopestill, a woman who could host a dinner party for a dozen MPS without once betraying the use of an eyelash curler, had refused any form of concrete instruction. When Clara had finally asked, in whispered agony, about what to expect on her wedding night, Lady Hopestill replied with, "There will be cake, and at some point you will be expected to bear an heir, but not at the same moment, obviously." The ambiguity was by design. Victorian society operated on a cultural principle I like to call, speak no evil, know even less. To be truly refined was to be entirely ignorant of bodily matters. Honestly, some girls probably believed babies arrived via strongly worded telegram. To complicate matters, Victorian England was also home to a bewildering amount of pseudoscience and moral panic. Male health experts, many without anything resembling a medical degree, published grim little pamphlets warning that any stirrings of desire in men or women might lead to one's downfall, madness, or even spontaneous combustion. One popular myth within these lovely guides suggested that women who enjoyed conjugal relations were suffering from a disorder. Passion, you see, was for French women and fainting couches. Because of this, the wedding night became something of a ceremonial trial, a performance for which the bride had zero rehearsal, and the groom, if he was lucky enough to have attended Eton, might know only slightly more, and that knowledge might include drawings involving togas and unclear metaphors. Clara's gown, heavy with lace and a sense of impending confusion, took nearly an hour to remove entirely. By the time she reached her candlelit bridal chamber, her husband, the respectful and equally bewildered Lord Theodore, had already knocked over a gas lamp and spent 20 minutes trying to light a fire while pretending it was a legitimate masculine distraction. What followed between them was less a moment of passion and more a very polite apology, followed by a long discussion about what ought to happen and otherwise might be expected. Marriage manuals were consulted. Diagrams were poorly drawn. At one point, there was an awkward toast, but in the end, they managed something, not entirely accurate, but conducted with mutual goodwill and a certain endearing lack of physical coordination. The true terror of the Victorian wedding night wasn't always the act itself, but the absence of clarity, the weight of societal shame, and the inescapable feeling that even asking a question might render you a scandal. So when you picture those lace-veiled brides heading off toward their wedding chamber, know this: most were armed with little more than a vague sense of impending duty, a lavender sachet, and perhaps the hope that someone, someday, would finally write a sensible, illustrated guide, preferably with footnotes. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Rest now and let your mind curl softly around the rustling hymns and half-whispered secrets of the past. When gentle evening light spilled through lace curtains and the lamplighter passed by with his long stick and sleepy swagger, the Victorian bride sat in her boudoir, corset half loosened, hairpins scattered like fallen soldiers, and nerves unraveling faster than her delicate gloves. One might picture her fluttering fan in one hand and a scented handkerchief in the other, but more often than not, she was quietly panicking behind a closed door, feeling woefully unprepared for an event that no etiquette book had ever truly explained. For all the crocheted covers and ornamental modesty, the Victorians were not, let's say, the best at talking about that. Blame Queen Victoria, perhaps, who adored her husband, Prince Albert, with enough passion to cause envy among the potted ferns, yet was delicately mum on the particulars of conjugal bliss. Officially, a well-brought-up young lady was to enter marriage as pure as newly laundered linen, knowing little more about her husband's anatomy than what might be hinted at by a particularly vivid oil painting of Adam and Eve. Education, if one could call it that, came in several delightful forms. Sometimes a mother, usually while pouring tea and refusing to meet her daughter's eye, might offer something that resembled advice. Vague phrases like, "Be submissive, dear, but not entirely lifeless," or "Just lie back and think of England," were popular. Another classic was a whispered, "You'll find out soon enough," accompanied by the kind of nervous laughter typically heard before a surprise dental extraction. Now, one might reasonably ask, why weren't these young women told what to expect? Well, because speaking of intimate matters was considered dreadfully improper, and the Victorians were Olympic gold medalists in not speaking of things. In polite society, people rarely mentioned arms or legs. Those were limbs, if mentioned at all. The word trousers was enough to make a maiden aunt wobble on her feet. So naturally, if saying pants was risque, then explaining what happens after the wedding cake was cut and the guests had gone home was entirely off the conversational map. What scraps of knowledge a bride might pick up often came from novels, heavily censored ones, or scandalous French books passed between giggling cousins. There were also ominous medical texts available for those reckless enough to peek. These featured alarming Latin terms, brooding illustrations of the human anatomy that looked more like maritime maps than people, and frequent reminders that excessive marital activity might cause consumption, hysteria, or spontaneous combustion of the soul. Some girls were warned in terrifying terms, tales told by family matriarchs who painted the marriage bed as a battlefield. "It will hurt," they said, grim as dry toast. "But that is your duty." Duty, a word that hovered over Victorian bedrooms like unused chandelier, dust. Women were taught that their happiness came second to the responsibilities of wifedom, keeping house, attending garden parties, and responding to marital affection with the compliance of a well-trained cocker spaniel. And don't even get us started on the wedding night undergarments. Imagine, if you will, a bride standing in a room thick with the scent of lavender sachets and anxiety, dressed in multiple layers that had to be untied, unbuttoned, unlaced, and possibly reasoned with. Petticoats, chemises, drawers, corsets, bustles, stockings secured by garters, and a gown that required at least 2 ladies' maids and a week of planning to remove. The stripping of a Victorian bride was less like a romantic undressing and more like disassembling a mechanical onion. And meanwhile, the groom, often no better informed and frequently quite nervous himself, might be mentally flipping through his own internal Rolodex of cricket scores, ancient Latin declensions, or the absinthe-fueled advice of some rakish cousin at the club. In short, both parties were often embarking on their new life as man and wife, with less preparation than one might give to baking a pie. It was awkward, bewildering, tender, comedic, and occasionally joyous, despite, or perhaps because of, the complete lack of instruction. But it begs an even bigger and more curious question. How did the Victorians, with their tight-laced morality and muffled desire, manage to conceive such large families, 10, 12 children a common count, when even their candlesticks blushed at the word pregnant? That of course leads us to a peculiar chapter in marital advice, involving certain matrimonial manuals, some bluntly named furniture, and one Queen's very creative table legs. But all in due time. For now, let your thoughts drift like falling petals through the creaky hallways of Victorian courtship, where love was defined in glances, expectations loomed in every bouquet, and behind every tulle veil was the quiet terror of the unknown, swaddled in lace and denial. Let's see what happened when society finally confronted the question it had tried so very hard to avoid. Beneath the gaslight glow of a respectable sitting room in 1870s Norwich, young ladies gathered like moths around a teapot. Their conversation fluttered delicately between lace trims, embroidery floss, and the grim, unspoken thing that dwelled beyond the wedding breakfast. If a maiden dared to whisper too loudly about the subject, an aunt might faint into the wallpaper. And yet, curiosity, it rustled beneath those corseted bodices like a naughty breeze. To understand why the Victorian bride approached her wedding night less like a romantic heroine and more like a condemned man being marched toward the guillotine, one must step back and admire the exquisite fog of ignorance the era so lovingly embroidered around all things sensual. Proper young ladies were expected to know absolutely nothing, zilch, about human anatomy, personal pleasure, or heaven forbid, male physiology. In fact, many Victorian girls went to their weddings believing that marriage simply meant acquiring a new surname, some tasteful chinaware, and possibly a houseplant. Mysterious and unnerving encounters were expected, of course, but few brides understood just how deeply unsettling their wedding night might prove. The problem, gloriously, absently, disastrously, was education, or rather, the creative and ongoing commitment to not give anyone a proper one. You see, sex education in Victorian England was like the unicorn of the moral universe. Everyone knew it didn't exist, but no one dared admit it might be useful. Middle and upper-class girls were taught to be ladylike, which meant avoiding any knowledge that might make them, well, human. Conversations about reproduction were cloaked in euphemism, wrapped in doilies, and locked in mahogany cabinets alongside the port. Parents often assumed that when their daughters married, some secret feminine instinct, or possibly just divine intervention, would kick in at the critical moment, and everything would unfold like the end of a Jane Austen novel, tastefully, discreetly, and without anyone getting too exposed. Spoiler alert, it did not. A favorite custom among anxious betrothed women was the pre-wedding cautionary tale. Picture it, a mother or aunt taking her niece aside with trembling hands, pouring a sherry she didn't really need, then very solemnly saying something like, "Dearest Emily, there are duties of the marriage bed which may not be comfortable, but one must smile through them." That was it. That was the talk. Some brides entered their honeymoon convinced that the matrimonial act was, quote, done in the dark very quickly and never spoken of again. Others concluded, based on gory whispers from servants, that it resembled a sort of genteel mugging. And then there were the unfortunate few who believed, in all seriousness, that kissing too passionately might lead to spontaneous combustion. Truly, our ancestors were built different. Even doctors didn't help the matter. The leading medical theory of the day was that women had no sexual desire whatsoever. None. Female pleasure, hysteria. And if a woman happened to enjoy herself, well, clearly something was wrong with her uterus, which could be remedied with cold baths, smelling salts, or a brisk gallop on horseback. One begins to wonder how the human race survived the 19th century at all. Still, it wasn't all whispered horror and baffling parental silence. Some brides were given a little guidance, terribly belated and wildly cryptic, by illicit novels hidden under mattresses or passed furtively between cousins. Many a Victorian nightstand concealed a well-thumbed copy of The Pearl, a scandalously saucy magazine posing as literature. Think of it as the 1879 version of Clearing Your browser history. But really, beneath all the repression and frilly curtain panels, there was one idea consistently drilled into the Victorian bride. Obedience. A good wife was obedient. She tended to her husband's needs, even the needs she didn't remotely understand. And she mustn't ask questions, especially not about anything involving trousers. Open curiosity was unbecoming. Enthusiasm, slightly monstrous. Society trained brides to expect discomfort. And in many cases, that training worked a little too well. Imagine then the quiet terror that settled over a lace-draped bridal chamber at twilight. A husband undressing with awkward solemnity. A wife clutching the edge of the bed, like a woman awaiting painless dental surgery. Neither quite sure what to do, both hoping they'd remembered to lock the door. And so, the Victorian wedding night was often not a night of passion, but one of confusion, tension, and the soft, awkward sound of someone knocking over a kerosene lamp. Next, we shall peek behind the heavy velvet curtain of marital medical advice, where doctors helpfully diagnosed women with issues like wandering wombs and recommended a healthy walk or perhaps a firm slap. Sleep well, dear listener. The madness is just beginning. After the nervous clinking of teacups and the polite stifling of obvious curiosity, the Victorian bridal shower, of sorts, would come to an end. Having been gifted with items such as decorative hairbrushes, fine linen handkerchiefs, and perhaps a small bottle of lavender scent, the bride-to-be was now expected to float on a fainting cloud of anticipation. And in some sense, she did. Only the cloud was heavier than mist and primarily filled with anxiety and lace. Lots of lace. You see, in Victorian England, young women, especially of the middle and upper classes, were expected to approach their wedding day a bit like a martyr going to sainthood. There was a great ceremony, some heavily floral decor, a pale face, and absolutely no idea what would happen afterward. Bridal education, such as it existed, didn't. There were no school programs, no helpful pamphlets, and certainly no cheery aunt leaning in with a diagram and a cup of cocoa. The closest thing to an explanation might come in the form of euphemisms wrapped in poetry and disappointment. Occasionally, a mother might step in, if she was especially brave, a touch eccentric, or had secretly read those French novels. She may shuffle awkwardly into her daughter's powdery boudoir, cough twice to gather courage, and murmur something about wifely duty being an act of devotion, before immediately redirecting to the topic of nightgowns and how one must always keep a basin of fresh water near the bed for modest sponge baths. Meanwhile, the poor bride would nod solemnly and go back to arranging her gloves in size order, wondering if wifely duty possibly meant helping one's husband with his cravat, or perhaps trimming his toenails. Something vaguely unpleasant, to be sure. But there were other, more dramatic approaches. Some well-meaning matrons, usually older relatives with vivid imaginations and fewer social filters, passed along cautionary tales that walked the delicate line between fairy tale and medical horror. They would whisper with wide eyes about wedding nights gone terribly wrong. One involved a cousin named Mildred, who allegedly fled the marriage bed after her husband's mere attempt to consummate the union caused her to faint clean off a velvet settee. Another tale spoke of a chambermaid who had seen her mistress's wedding night linens and needed to be sent to a spa in Bath for a full month to recover. The concept of the marital act, as it was called with Victorian gravitas, was cloaked in such secrecy and myth that some brides, understandably, believed it might require ceremonial robes and possibly the recitation of the Lord's Prayer backward. Here, one must not overlook the influence of books, because while Google had yet to be invented by a comfortable 120 years, people still sought answers the old-fashioned way, by reading things slightly above their comprehension level and entirely outside of context. Ladies' magazines of the era did their part. They offered advice columns and improving literature, filled with general encouragement, but no actual information. A particularly helpful bit of advice once appeared in an 1873 issue of the Englishwoman's Domestic Magazine. On your wedding night, think of Queen Victoria and do not scream. Quite encouraging. There were also medical texts, which, while theoretically more scientific, were often written by men who had clearly taken liberties with both diagram and dignity. They would describe the marital relation as something noble and healthful, ideal for producing heirs and building character, and sometimes involving vaguely described intimate proximity that might lead to dizziness or redness behind the ears. To make matters worse, or more charming, if you're the sort of person who enjoys a well-timed corset metaphor, Victorian brides were often trussed up in wedding attire, not exactly conducive to spontaneity. The wedding corset alone, with its 22 steel boning strips and miles of embroidered detail, could take a team of 2 to 3 ladies' maids to remove. Disrobing could take upwards of an hour, during which time the poor bride might become so nervous that she'd require smelling salts or a strategically delayed hairpin search. Still, amidst all this ambiguity and anxiety, there were those who navigated it with a bit of heart. Couples who found themselves awkwardly laughing behind drapes, husbands who, rather than storming into the bedroom like a Shakespearean duke, asked gently, "Are you quite all right?" Perhaps a little back-patting occurred, perhaps an awkward metaphor about gardening was graciously accepted. It was, after all, a beginning, however bumbled. And after the tea had gone cold, and the laces untied, and the mystery had begun to unravel, one discovered that a wedding night, like many things in life, was occasionally terrifying, often confusing, but sometimes survivable with good manners and a sense of humor. Now, while the bride is still fumbling with her hairpins and her new husband is patiently waiting with a plate of leftover cake, let's drift gently into the gathering shadows of what awaited them next. The marital bed, the ornamental bolster, and the mystery of those truly ridiculous nightcaps. Imagine a quiet English drawing room around the year 1857. The wallpaper is floral. The air smells faintly of boiled cabbage and lavender sachets, and the fireplace, though entirely unnecessary in midsummer, has been lit anyway, simply because it looks proper. Sitting stiffly on a settee upholstered in something that is probably printed with allegorical swans, a young lady in a tightly laced corset reads her Bible upside down. Not because she's illiterate, though, truth be told, her French is stronger than her comprehension of Genesis, but because she's been distracted since Aunt Millicent whispered something about her conjugal duties after the wedding. Now, one might imagine that being a Victorian bride came with slippers of ivory satin, kisses beneath honeysuckle, and an obligatory poem written by the groom in near illegible pencil. And yes, there were all those things, but alongside the lace and longing came something else. A fluttering, frightened anticipation of something she could not name, and often wasn't allowed to. You see, the Victorian era was absolutely bursting with euphemisms. A gentleman didn't simply walk down the street, he strolled at a respectable pace. A lady didn't sweat, heaven forfend, she glistened with exertion. And when it came to anything even vaguely resembling intimacy, the entire English language held hands, closed its eyes, and repeated phrases like marital bliss and the fruit of union, until no one quite remembered what they'd been talking about. Education on certain matters, let us say, was less than comprehensive. Girls were brought up to be modest, virtuous, and astonishingly clueless. A well-brought-up young lady might be fairly fluent in needlepoint, watercolors, and what to say when someone drops their opera glasses, but entirely oblivious to what, precisely, occurred after the rice had been thrown and the betrothal cake had been sliced. Mothers, sensibly, sometimes attempted to broach these subjects. Insensibly, however, they often did it approximately 5 minutes before the wedding, while adjusting a veil and pretending not to be flustered. The conversation might go something like this: "Darling, after tonight, you'll belong to your husband, in every way, like legally, and spiritually. Oh, and physically. Physically like sharing the dinner spoon? More like, well, you'll find out." Naturally, this only heightened the sense of doom-laced mystery, akin to being told that you'll be climbing a mountain soon, but nobody will reveal what a mountain actually is. Some brides arrived at their wedding night imagining it would be a gentle exchange of forehead caresses. Others feared it would resemble a surgical procedure, as Victorian medical texts, never famed for their warmth, often described the act in language more suitable for barnyard inspections. A few brave, or perhaps desperate souls turned to books. Not novels, of course. Those were dangerous, full of emotion and French thoughts. No, they turned to guides, published by doctors, or at least men claiming to be doctors, who wrote thick volumes with disturbing titles like The Secrets of Matrimonial Union Unveiled or hygienic marriage, the scientific method of spousal appropriation. These tomes usually featured chapter headings that would startle a goat. For example, of the nightly duties of the male, or the wife's best recourse in case of unusual enthusiasm. Needless to say, reading such a book before the wedding night was more likely to cause cold sweats than calm curiosity, especially if one encountered phrases like vital tonic energies or procreative exertion, which left one wondering whether marriage might require a spotter and weight belt. And then there was the strange case of bridal advice given not by mothers, but by older cousins, orphaned aunts, or in some cases, the family governess, who had lived long enough and underpaid enough to dispense knowledge like a crow flinging breadcrumbs with its beak. These advisors tended to speak in riddles designed to clarify absolutely nothing. "Just remember, my dear," said Cousin Hermione, late one evening during embroidery, "he'll expect you to be like a ship in harbour, but also like the sea, and firm, but yielding. Also breathe through your mouth. What? It's best not to blink too much. Good night." And so, as the candles flickered low and the bride stared at the embroidered ceiling of her bridal suite, she thought not of passion, nor poetry, nor even duty. Mostly she thought, "I sincerely hope I don't have to sing." In the quiet that followed, she clutched her cambric handkerchief like a talisman and prayed to be gently enlightened by whatever mystery the pillows might unveil. But of course, pillows were notoriously silent on such matters. Now, if you can imagine that young bride drifting into an uneasy doze, slippers removed with somber ceremonialism, then you might also picture what came next in the matrimonial education of a Victorian wife. Something rather curious began to shape her expectations. Let's rest for a moment there. If you were a well-mannered young lady in Victorian England, and you felt your personality had more sparkle than a teaspoon of foggy porridge, then fret not. Finishing school would politely scrub any remnants of originality right out of you. Think of it as charm school, for charm removal. By the mid-19th century, finishing schools were considered the ultimate chrysalis, a place where awkward teenage caterpillars were carefully wrapped in etiquette and emerged as elegant, if slightly emotionally constipated butterflies. Particularly in upper and middle-class society, these institutions were less concerned with practical education and more focused on training young women to become decorative yet obedient appendages for future husbands. While young men might spend their adolescent years yelling in Latin and rowing boats for their muscles and their masculinity, young ladies were tastefully trained in French, embroidery, pianoforte, and how to faint decorously when someone mentioned ankles. Now, finishing school was not simply a matter of learning to pour tea at a 45-degree angle or to glide like a ghost down a drawing room floor. It was, quite unsubtly, a staging ground for bridal preparation. Not in the modern, empowering sense of knowing who you are before committing to another soul, but more in the "let's make sure you don't displease your husband with your salad fork usage" variety. The curriculum was less life skills and more wife skills. One might be instructed in the softer sciences, flower arrangement, penmanship, moral literature, and the dangerous sport known as silent suffering. The idea was to create a woman so refined, so delicate, and so agreeable that she could host a dinner party without ever expressing a single original thought. A Victorian ideal more honoured in the breach than in the observance, but one held up nonetheless like a starched petticoat of virtue. And yes, before you ask, these young ladies were often left utterly, blissfully clueless about human anatomy. The realities of marriage, the squelchy, emotional, physically complicated bits, were considered too indecent for polite conversation. Imagine being 17 and told by your governess that your husband would soon visit your chamber to perform his sacred husbandly duty, all without further explanation. You might brace yourself for something resembling an exorcism or a tax inspection. Indeed, many a young bride-to-be confessed to fearing the wedding night as if it involved some mystical sacrifice. And in a way it did, the sacrifice of innocence on the altar of euphemism. Some mothers, when pressed to give the talk, might hand over a tiny leather-bound book titled something like Matronly Advice for Modest Wives, penned in 1812 and revised precisely never. Its contents offered such wisdom as submit cheerfully, though you may feel misgivings, and cleanliness is next to submission. If emotional support were a weather system, this would be a light drizzle of obligation passing through a region of heavy repression. Even in the progressive establishments, the idea of giving young women actual biological knowledge was considered borderline scandalous. To know too much was to risk becoming, brace yourself, forward. And no one wants to marry a young lady who knows where her own uterus lives. That's positively French. And so, instead of empowering education, many finishing schools arm their students with a toolkit of gentle lies and floral metaphors. A particularly favored metaphor went something like this. Marriage is like a delicate rose garden. There may be thorns, but with patience, the petals will bloom. Which sounds lovely, until a bride finds herself staring at her husband and wondering which gardening tool to use in self-defense. To be fair, not all finishing schools were grim dystopias of passive aggression and piano scales. Some were warm, female-led environments offering camaraderie, shelter from the expectations of male-dominated society, and a chance to inhale the fine scent of social ambition. A few even had horses. But for many young women, finishing school was where their sense of self was sanded down to fit into the gilded, rigid box marked wife material. And no matter how many doilies they had crocheted, or how gracefully they waltzed, nothing could quite prepare them for what would happen when the veil was lifted in more ways than one. And so, with a head full of Shakespeare and a heart full of undiscussed anxieties, our Victorian bride would leave the orderly corridors of her finishing school behind and take her trembling steps toward the wedding aisle, and beyond it, into a world that no embroidery sampler had ever truly explained. But before the bouquet is tossed and the mystery of matrimony begins, there remains a final bit of ceremonial preparation, involving white satin corsets and a moral expectation stitched tighter than the waistband on Aunt Agatha's afternoon bustle. Matrimony, for the Victorian bride, was not only a change in name and housing arrangements, it was, quite alarmingly, a transition from complete ignorance to, well, let's just say, enthusiastic confusion. You see, in the sugar-dusted parlours of 19th century propriety itself was something of an overgrown topiary, carefully trimmed, strictly shaped, but quite capable of hiding something very awkward behind the hedges. As it turns out, most Victorian brides had no clue what was going to happen on their wedding night. Like none. Zip. Nada. The only birds and bees they knew about were, quite literally, birds and actual bees. A woman could embroider a tea cozy blindfolded while spoon-feeding barley water to a canary, but she wouldn't be told, not even in the vaguest of euphemisms, what marriage truly entailed. Why? Well, because delicacy was the national sport. Polite society had achieved such mastery over repression that many mothers believed Forewarning a daughter about physical intimacy was downright indecent. It might tarnish her innocence, or worse, excite her curiosity. And if curiosity hasn't ruined many a Victorian engagement, it certainly gave the honeymoon a head start on awkwardness. So picture it: a wide-eyed bride in pearl buttons and lace, clutching a rose-scented handkerchief, nervously accepting a glass of warm milk for the nerves. Her new husband is pacing gently by the fire, wondering if now is the moment to begin. Whatever it is, one is meant to begin. Of course, the groom didn't always know much either. In some cases, young men were sent off to university and returned with a degree, a top hat, and some hastily whispered advice from a cousin with a moustache and suspicious knowledge of Paris. "Just be gentle," the cousin says, as he disappears back into opium-perfumed infamy. Not exactly the Enlightenment. For women, there were solutions, if one can call them that. Some received gifts on the eve of the wedding known as marriage manuals. These were small, discreetly bound books pretending to be about household management or the spiritual union of souls. But on page 47, beneath the section on folding linens properly, there would be a tastefully phrased nod to conjugal duties. Sentences like, "The husband may feel a natural insistence, the wife a duty to comply, yet with measured reserve," which clears things up not one bit. More daring ladies, rebels really, took matters into their own lace-gloved hands. There were shocking reports of brides bribing the housemaid for intel. Housemaids, of course, knew absolutely everything. They'd seen the grocer's boy slip Anna Talbot a wink and heard cries through thin walls that no proper lady should recognize. Still, these covert operations were frowned upon. A soon-to-be bride asking how it all works was seen much in the way one might view a vicar sneaking into a vaudeville show. Not quite scandalous, but certainly concerning. Even physicians were hesitant to dispense useful information. Victorian medical literature had an almost pantomime-level commitment to avoidance. Men were advised not to overexert themselves, somehow stretching the idea of honeymoon exhaustion into full martyrdom. Meanwhile, women were advised to lie back, think of England, and perhaps recite Psalm 23 if necessary. One woman, Elizabeth Blackwell, who became the first female doctor in the US, and whose eyebrows permanently furrowed with good reason, was utterly appalled by how little women were taught. Her solution was education, naturally, but even she admitted that her well-meaning pamphlets were unlikely to find their way into the hands of Charlotte from Surrey, with a corset too tight and a prayer book clutched like battle armor. And so, in the amber candlelight of the bridal chamber, with embroidered wallpaper and a vase of ever so slightly wilting bluebells, many Victorian couples essentially reenacted Two Deer trying to decipher a trombone. There were tears, there were apologies, there were fainting spells, and one can only guess what tidbits the chambermaid overheard the next morning, usually while reclaiming the dish of warm milk, untouched. And yet, somehow, the species continued, eventually. But before we drift further into the crimson-walled boudoir, let us turn our attention to another peculiar bedroom companion that haunted the minds of brides, the spectre of scandal. Not the kind that made headlines, but the quiet, hidden kind, embroidered into silence. As the gas lamps flickered to life in the drawing rooms and parlours of Victorian England, a curious sound often echoed through the dimly lit hallways of well-appointed townhouses and manors alike. It was the rustle of silk, the snapping shut of a velvet-bound diary, and the nervous sigh of a young bride engaging in what could only be described as desperate literary reconnaissance. You see, in a world where modesty was exalted with aggressive fervour and table legs were cloaked for decency, the average Victorian bride was armed with fewer facts about the workings of her own anatomy than she had crocheted antimacassars. And with a wedding night looming like a thunderstorm on the pristine horizon of her social debut, she did what any rational person would. She sought answers among contraband books, whispered gossip, and the occasional dreadfully awkward chat with a once bride herself, now an experienced matron who spoke in euphemisms so thick they could be sliced and served with jam. In theory, a young lady might have received the talk from her mother. In practice, this often went something like, "You must be brave, my dear," followed by a long, haunted silence, and perhaps, if the girl were truly lucky, a vague reference to the marital embrace, delivered with the same solemnity one might use to describe the Black Death. Victorian etiquette books, ever the bastions of cryptic advice, offered such helpful guidance as, "Upon the nuptial bed, comport thyself with grace and forbearance," which is frankly the sort of instruction one might give to a shivering penguin before an impromptu ballroom dance competition. And so, clandestine reading became its own form of bride-to-be rebellion. Newly engaged women might pass along dog-eared copies of certain French medical books, carefully tucked between hymnals and cookery volumes. Some of these publications masqueraded with titles like The Mysteries of Womanhood or Marital Duties and Proprieties for the Refined Gentlewoman, though their actual content ranged from mildly useful to wildly improbable. Meanwhile, illustrations, when present, were comically unhelpful. One infamous example included an etching of a muscular Greek god figure holding aloft a torch beside a bed, accompanied by the caption, "The husband, in full aspect of vigor." Interpretive implications aside, this did little to prepare an anxious bride for what exactly would happen when the bedroom door clicked shut and Aunt Eugenia could no longer barge in with opinions about pillowcases. Adding to the confusion, the prevailing medical opinion of the time was, well, whimsical. Female desire was considered either non-existent or pathological. A woman too eager to learn about sexuality might be politely described as nervous. If she showed signs of figuring things out on her own, there was always the looming threat of a fainting couch and a regimen of nerve tonics, including tinctures containing alcohol, opium, or helpful compounds like lead. It bears repeating, these were not ideal circumstances for launching into one's romantic life. For some brides, the wedding night was less a moment of tender connection and more a plunge into disorienting absurdity. With no clear sense of what was expected, and only the vague suggestion that endurance was ladylike, many simply closed their eyes and thought of England, or more specifically, Queen Victoria, who, despite having 9 children, made very few public comments about the act of acquiring them. There were, of course, exceptions. Brides who had some kind guidance, fortunate mismatches of youthful curiosity and patient grooms, or simply the unflinching wit to carry them through the whole ordeal with a raised eyebrow and a steady hand on the bedpost. But for every such tale, there were scores more whispered confessions, hastily scribbled diary entries, or starlit chats in gardens where one bride would consolingly assure another that it isn't quite as dreadful after the third occurrence, provided you've had at least 2 glasses of sherry. And yet, amid all this mystery and muffled giggling behind fans, love still found its way, quiet, blushing, bewildered, but undeterred. For even if one didn't know precisely what was meant by marital bliss, there lingered the hope that perhaps it might be, discovered like a misplaced glove, found eventually by accident or perseverance. As the fire in the hearth dimmed and the household settled into its nightly hush, our Victorian bride lay beneath embroidered coverlets, eyes wide and heart pounding, reciting silent litanies of etiquette, hearsay, and sheer conjecture. She didn't know quite what she was about to experience, but she had braided her hair, prayed for forbearance, and hidden a lavender sachet beneath the pillow, just in case. Next, we'll slide a little deeper into the candlelit glow of Victorian bedrooms. Not the romanticized kind one might read about in poetry, but the real ones, where the aesthetic of gloomy fussiness reigned supreme and intimacy often had to compete with corset bruises and chaperone footsteps in the hallway. If one were to glimpse a Victorian bridal trousseau, that delicate bundle of laces, linen, and lavender sachets, one might believe the era was steeped in nothing but modesty and monograms. But behind every petticoat stitched by anxious aunties and every corset carefully strung by hands, both diligent and quite possibly trembling, lingered more than just the scent of rosewater. There also lurked the curious absence of useful knowledge. You see, dear listener, as the wedding date tiptoed nearer, visions of lace-veiled ceremonies and garlands of myrtle may have filled the drawing room. But when it came to the mysterious matter of marital duties, namely those expected to occur after the fruitcake had been respectfully served, no one quite dared speak plainly. This was not an era known for candor. In fact, euphemisms were polished to such a high shine, one could lose sight of their original purpose. A bride might be told her wifely role involved tending to her husband's needs, which could, quite seriously, be mistaken for handing him a cup of tea and a good pair of slippers. If lucky, she might receive a painfully vague and unhelpfully embroidered booklet entitled "What Every Young Lady Ought to Know," eventually, if she must. And thus, a young woman might find herself standing at the threshold of the marriage bed, thinking her responsibilities were merely to undress without fainting and perhaps remember which side of the pillow was hers. In truth, faced with a husband expecting more than polite conversation and a shared appreciation for antimacassars, many a new bride entered her wedding night, wide-eyed with terror and more often than not, clutching a Bible like it was an instruction manual. Now, to be fair to these Victorian young ladies, they were not stupid. They were simply, intentionally uneducated. Politeness, at least in the upper and middling classes, had evolved into a form of weaponized ignorance. If one knew too much, or, heavens forbid, enjoyed certain aspects of conjugal life, one's moral character was immediately suspect. A woman of high virtue simply didn't inquire about such things. And so, ignorance became a badge of honor stitched invisibly beneath the layers of lace. Not knowing was, ironically, the most proper thing one could do. Advice books, if consulted, tended to be less helpful and more discouraging. One popular tract warned women to submit with grace, adding reassuringly that true ladies feel little desire. Another offered that modesty should be one's key concern, even while in the privacy of the marriage bed, as if shame could act as both curtain and contraceptive. Let us not forget that some young women did try to ask. They dared approach their mothers, hoping for wisdom handed down across generations, the same way pickling recipes or embroidery techniques might travel. What they received instead was often a blush, a stammer, or at best a cryptic anecdote about allowing nature to take its course, which sounded suspiciously like gardening advice. It was, in that sense, no small wonder that many brides experienced their first night of marriage not as a romantic crescendo, but as a poorly explained school field trip, one where no one packed lunch, No one marked the exits, and the chaperones had all gone mysteriously missing. Of course, much depended on one's husband. If he was kind, patient, and possessed at least a passing respect for human feelings, the mysteries of matrimony might unfold with awkward tenderness and time, and possibly help from a discreet French manual smuggled beneath a copy of the Times. But if he were less sensitive, the experience could be traumatic enough to send a young wife silently screaming into the antimacassar. Meanwhile, the real experts on the subject, the servants, watched from sidelines, shaking their heads. Even they, schooled more by life than by catechism, knew enough to laugh gently behind handkerchiefs at their mistress's blushing bewilderment. One chambermaid reportedly remarked, "She's got 6 ivory-backed brushes, but hasn't the faintest idea what to do with a husband." And yet, despite all the awkwardness, confusion, and critically missing footnotes, life pressed on. Brides became wives, wives became mothers, and somehow, through whispered fragments of advice, the occasional scandalous novel, and a great deal of trial and error, the curtain lifted, if ever so slowly. Still, for many Victorian brides, that wedding night remained not the fairy tale they'd quietly embroidered into their PJ case monogram, but a rather bewildering passage through lace-curtained expectations and thunderous silences. But if you're wondering what role the unfortunate wedding corset played in all this, well, that tale is as tightly laced as the garment itself. Gently now, take a breath. We'll turn the page on that secret in just a moment, if one were to wander into a Victorian drawing room. Quiet footsteps across paisley carpet, soft gaslight shadows dancing on the wallpaper, a distant grandfather, clock ticking the minutes away. One might notice something a little curious. The sudden, breathless hush that settled over the room at the mere mention of the phrase wedding night. It was not the hush of polite anticipation, nor of romantic thrill, but something altogether more awkward, like when someone says moist at a tea party. You see, the Victorian wedding night was not so much spoken about as it was hinted at in riddles, veiled in euphemism, and draped in layers of lace both literal and metaphorical. Young brides, often having received an education full of embroidery, Latin verbs, and a studied avoidance of human anatomy, were thoroughly unprepared for what came, or didn't, after the cake was cut. It all began with the notion of innocence. A Victorian bride was expected to enter matrimony as pure as a sugar cube in a porcelain teacup, and leave her wedding night with that illusion gently shattered like a frost-covered rose. Unfortunately, because purity was the goal, and ignorance was mistaken for virtue, many young women got their first education on sexual matters from the most unreliable of instructors. Whispers, novels, and the stray confidant who had either no idea what she was talking about, or far too vivid a recollection involving lace bodices and the phrase, "Just lie back, dear." The crown jewel of misinformation came in the form of stealthily circulated advice pamphlets. Elegant little booklets with scandalously plain titles like "What Every Woman Should Know Without Knowing She Knows It." These guides promised mothers a discreet way to prepare their daughters for wifely duties, and delivered content so vague one might read the entire volume and believe that consummation involved nothing more than a reassuring pat on the shoulder. One actual line went something like, "The marital act must be borne with patience, a quiet resignation, and prayers for one's constitution." You see, nothing gets the romantic pulse racing like combining faith, digestion, and passive suffering. And then there were the mothers. Bless their tightly corseted hearts. Victorian motherhood involved astronomical amounts of embroidery, and absolutely no interest in telling one's daughter what her body might be involved in post-vows. The closest some came was a faint cough, and the advice, just do as I did and think of the empire. Not to be outdone in the awkward department, young Victorian grooms also entered the honeymoon suite, armed with loads of confidence and very little comprehension. Most had picked up their understanding from disreputable novels, worldly friends, or unstable encounters in smoky corners of London's less reputable districts. Let's just say that mismatched expectations played a significant role in making many a wedding night less than cinematic. There was a prevailing belief, troubling and utterly unhelpful, that women were naturally lacking in desire. Much of the advice published for gentlemen encouraged them to proceed with caution, but implied that female enjoyment was both rare and unnecessary. Combine that with anxiety, inexperience, and the fact that hotel room heating in 1862 wasn't exactly reliable, and you have quite the romantic steam bath of nerves and clumsiness. But let us not overlook the fashions. For what is anxiety without a few dozen buttons? Bridal nightwear in the Victorian period could generously be described as impregnable. Layer upon layer of lace, cotton, modesty panels and ribbons crafted an ensemble less suited for romance and more for defensive architecture. Removing a corset alone took the better part of an afternoon and several strong opinions. That said, some couples found ways to muddle through, as humans tend to do. Not every first night was a comedy of confusion and crinoline, but for a significant majority, the initial encounter was approached with the forlorn urgency of someone about to attempt firewalking after reading half a manual in Latin. It is little wonder, then, that many Victorian brides approached their nuptials with a blend of anticipation and what one might call internalized dread, with a side of flower arrangements. But while they were tutored in deportment and hand-fan language, no useful tips appeared for what happened when the chamber door shut and the candles burned low. Soon, though, society would begin to murmur ever so slightly louder. Women, brave, curious, and occasionally very fed up, would seek real answers. Some would even write their own guides, with nonsense levels lowered and candles of clarity lit boldly in the fog. But before all that, there were still the bridal preparations, because nothing calms a nervous bride quite like a symbolic orange blossom, a half-day hair appointment with 3 bonnet changes and several stern warnings not to faint. Let us peek now, ever so gently, into the hours before the vows, when powdered, mothers fussed, sisters whispered, and bouquets hid trembling hands. It's dusk again in the English countryside, and somewhere between the sigh of the teapot and the clink of a parasol tip on cobblestone, another Victorian bride is preparing for the unknown. She's adjusting her gloves with nervous precision, as though white satin can strengthen the nerves. Outside, the horse-drawn carriage waits, and inside lies an entire world of marital mystery, rumour, and motherly advice that mostly consists of raised eyebrows and a non-committal hum. And that's the thing. Victorian brides weren't necessarily afraid of what actually happened on the wedding night. They were terrified because they had no earthly idea what would happen. It wasn't the content that scared them. It was the complete lack thereof. The silence, the void, the metaphorical elephant in the boudoir. You see, in a society so steeped in euphemism, it practically spoke in riddles. Direct conversation about, well, certain topics, was quietly packaged in moral parsley and then tossed into the fire. The average bride came to her bridal chamber armed with nothing but vague allusions to duty, whispers of making oneself agreeable, and possibly a lecture about fruit trees, delivered with such lyrical vagueness that even Wordsworth would have asked for a footnote. So what did Victorian mothers say when their daughters asked what to expect? The answer, typically, was that they didn't ask. A bride was supposed to glide serenely from virginity to marriage, from sleeved modesty to nightgowns buttoned all the way up the spine, without a single question. Discussing such matters, even with one's own mother, was simply not done. Or if it was done, it was done under the cover of great digestive distress, and with many references to morals, virtue, and how nice Mrs. Whitby's table linens were last Easter. But girls are curious creatures, even under 13 layers of petticoats and social taboo. Some tried to puzzle things out through books, which was laughable, because most books on the subject were either medical texts written in Latin, or moral tracts warning of the perils of, well, mostly everything. If you were lucky, you might stumble upon a copy of Dr. William Acton's treatise on functions of the reproductive organs, a thrilling volume that included such delightful conclusions as the majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feelings of any kind. That was considered a comfort, apparently. Bridal fears were so widespread that, in some social circles, discreet pamphlets were quietly circulated among gentry daughters, bearing such calming titles as What a Young Wife Should Know. These were supposed to explain the basic mechanics with stoic delicacy, and instead often read like oblique poems from a bureaucrat having a nervous breakdown. Sentences like, "The matrimonial act, when approached with dignity and restraint, need not cause undue upset, although some faintness may occur," were considered sufficient. No wonder the women were fainting. The problem wasn't just ignorance, it was the weaponization of chastity. For many Victorian girls, purity wasn't just a virtue. It was the main thing they were raised to offer to society. And the sudden pivot, literally within hours of saying "I do," from angelic innocence to a conjugal understanding of the flesh, was, quite understandably, mentally jarring. Imagine being praised for your restraint for 2 entire decades, and then enthusiastically hurried off to do the precise thing you've been implicitly taught to suppress. Men, by the way, weren't necessarily fountains of wisdom either. A significant number of Victorian grooms had as little practical knowledge as their brides. Some had even been sent off to brothels for experience, which, depending on the establishment, may or may not have involved actual education. In fact, there are documented cases of consummation being delayed not from fear, but from sheer bafflement about the mechanics. Let's just say that having a monocle did not automatically confer anatomical understanding. And then there were the horror stories, handed down in hushed tones among female friends and cousins. These were the tales meant to prepare a future bride, just in case. They ranged from the girl whose husband burst into tears of anxiety on the wedding night, to the one who thought she'd been injured irreparably because no one had explained. Particulars. But even in a roomful of dim gaslight and embroidered modesty, human nature found its way. Sometime after all the fretting, the lace unbuttoned itself, the nightgown gave up a few buttons, and people figured things out, more or less. Sometimes awkwardly, sometimes tenderly, and sometimes, as in one paper's account, through a series of incorrect guesses, followed by a trip to consult a doctor with very raised eyebrows. The Victorian wedding night, for all its mystery, was often less about sin or scandal than sheer trial and error. An awkward waltz performed in the dark by 2 people who'd never learned the steps, but were trying their earnest best not to step on each other's toes. and in the quiet aftermath, when the candles gutter low and the layers of the day have finally come off one by one, a peculiar calm sets in, not the wild romance of novels, nor the melodrama of whispered fears, but simply the hush of two people having crossed into strange, unspoken territory, where maybe, just maybe, the mystery begins to fade, ever so slowly. But of course, not everything ended in peace and serenity. For some, the real trouble was only just beginning. A short walk down a candlelit corridor of Victorian customs brings us, rather quietly, to a realm many would rather not enter at all, the wedding night itself. Not the dreamy, rose-petaled fairy tale sold in lace-trimmed etiquette, books, but the utterly awkward, anxiety-riddled, and oftentimes wildly misunderstood first encounter between two people now, technically and legally, bound in holy matrimony, and about to attempt physical intimacy with all the grace of two blindfolded Victorian armchairs crashing together. One might imagine the scene set delicately under fluttering curtains and the soft blush of oil lamps. But in reality, many newlywed brides entered that sacred bedchamber with the enthusiasm of someone heading for minor surgery, nervous, ill-informed, and possibly wearing 14 layers of underpinnings. Let us first meet the silent monster lingering in many a honeymoon suite: ignorance. You see, sex education in Victorian England made a cup of room-temperature tea seem scandalously explicit. Most brides were gently, or rather vaguely, warned about the duties of matrimony, with about as much detail as one might use to describe the texture of fog. Mothers might whisper something cryptic, like "you'll find out what to do," or "just think of the children," which sounds more like misplaced advice from a volunteer fire marshal. Books weren't much help either. The more respectable tomes, like the Book of Household Management by Mrs. Beeton, were excellent if your wedding night required instructions for boiling an egg, but left much to be desired on the topic of conjugal relations. And if a curious bride did encounter a more frank publication, often hidden in a dusty uncle's library, it was likely written in the breathless language of 19th century medicine, discussing manly essences and the liquefaction of passions, which had all the charm of a soggy biscuit. Then there were the outfits. Victorian bridal lingerie was less about seduction and more about cotton fortification. Corsets had to be unhooked, laces undone, petticoats peeled away, sometimes with the assistance of furniture. A determined husband likely needed a degree in nautical rigging. And as for the bride, she may have stood there, unsure whether to help or simply dissolve into the wallpaper out of sheer embarrassment. Add to this the unspoken terror inspired by the concept of deflowering, which sounds poetic in theory, but conjured images of pain, hymens, and 17 different euphemisms used exclusively by midwives and moralists. Indeed, many brides went to their first night believing it would hurt terribly or make them ill, or, according to one unlucky theory, turn respectable women into wanton puddles of sin. Some horror stories painted sex as a punishment in polite society. Others whispered that it was how women earned their ticket into upper-class maternity wards. Gentlemen did not always help. A cultured Victorian man might be as uninformed as his bride or, in the worst cases, utterly over-informed thanks to clandestine visits to disreputable establishments with red curtains and prominently displayed mustaches. Whether naive or seasoned, many husbands lacked the emotional vocabulary to address their bride's fear. Some stammered through the experience, others deflected with overconfidence, and a select few retreated entirely, resulting in consummations so delayed they started to feel like scholarly procrastination. And what of the honeymoon itself, that great Victorian invention designed to both celebrate marital unity and provide a socially acceptable excuse to leave town during what could otherwise be a loud and occasionally uninspiring week? Hotels were chosen for their discretion, with hosts trained in the sacred art of not asking questions. Entire inns across Britain flourished by simply pretending not to hear the late-night sounds of shyness meeting biology. Still, despite the confusion and clumsiness, there was, somewhere beneath the layers of crinolines and blush, a sincere tenderness. Many couples, bless them, figured things out slowly, tentatively, as trust bloomed like a reluctant flower in a frost. They had been taught to repress emotion, to make love seem clinical, procedural, or ominously sacred. But in those first uncertain nights, with a candle flickering low and the world fading to a hush, they often learned that intimacy could be softer, sillier, and more human than they ever expected. And so, with time, some of those frightened brides scrawled secret notes to sisters or confessed to friends that it wasn't all horror and whalebone. Some even smiled, furtively, knowing something their etiquette books hadn't dared reveal. Now, let us draw the curtains just an inch more and slip into bed with the next delicious absurdity. How Victorian architecture, for all its frills and fireplaces, was a master of preventing privacy at precisely the most inconvenient moments. As the sun set behind those neat lace curtains in a Victorian parlour, casting long golden shadows onto the hand-knotted rug, a young bride might have been found, not blissfully sipping tea, but nervously wringing her gloves, because while the wedding day had passed in a dreamy blur of corseted hugs, dry sponge cake, and flower petals awkwardly trampled by Aunt Edna's boots, the night loomed like a Dickensian plot twist. And the scariest part? Not a ghost nor a ghoul, but the looming spectre of marital consummation, embarked upon with less information than a soggy biscuit provides as a flotation device. Let's step gently into the world of the talk, or more accurately, the deafening silence that often replaced it. In upper and middle-class Victorian society, it was considered the height of impropriety to speak openly of the physical aspects of marriage, especially with young women who were presumed, no, insisted, to be pure and utterly ignorant of such crude matters. There was a belief, quite sincerely held, that an innocent bride shouldn't know too much, so as not to contaminate her delicate sensibilities with knowledge not deemed fit for a lady. Instead of proper instruction, many girls were handed a Bible, a hymnal, or if their mother was feeling particularly daring, a cryptic, high-minded pamphlet titled something like Marriage and the Duties Therein, a document so vague it might have just as easily been a guide to maintaining a greenhouse in a windstorm. Euphemisms were the rule. Words like intimacy, embracing one's wifely station, and, my personal favourite, yielding to the lordly affection of one's husband, did precious little to prepare a young woman whose prior education involved more embroidery samplers than anatomy lessons. This lack of clarity led to stories that were whispered behind gloved hands at tea parties and passed down like ominous heirlooms. Tales of women fainting dead away on their wedding night, of brides leaping from the bed and locking themselves in wardrobes upon the husband's first amorous approach. One positively sensational tale told of a bride who filled her ears with wax and stared stoically into the wallpaper for the entirety of her wedding night, believing the less she saw or heard, the holier she remained. And husbands weren't always fountains of guidance either. Frequently as confused as their wives, especially if they'd been dutifully chaperoned through their youth and hadn't so much as held elbows with a woman before marriage. That's not to say all Victorian grooms entered matrimony unread and uninformed. Some had, understandably, sought previous worldly experience, often with dubious ladies of the night, and even more dubious hygiene. But even that hardly equipped them to, say, communicate gently with a trembling wife who had been told she might die from the act, or warned, often by her own mother, that childbirth was punishment for Eve's original sin and not to expect such nonsense as pleasure. Mothers, bless them, bore their own share of complicated legacy. Many had once been terrified brides themselves, and now, faced with their daughter's impending honeymoon, found themselves in the bizarre position of wanting to protect her while still observing the all-important tenets of modesty. A maternal conversation might begin with something like, "Now, darling, when the time comes, remember to lie very still and think of the empire," and then shortly after with a lot of patting and brisk tea pouring. One rare exception was the occasional progressive aunt, often widowed, often splendidly odd, who, after 2 glasses of sherry and under heavy floral overtones, might whisper some practical advice about positions, ointments, or encouraging your new husband by telling him he resembles Lord Byron. But even these golden nuggets of realism were often delivered like state secrets. The result was a perfect storm of apprehension, social pressure, bodily ignorance, and an elaborate dance of duty and denial. The silken canopy beds of the era witnessed everything from tender, fumbling attempts at affection to awkward candlelit negotiations involving phrases like, "Are you quite sure this is the blessed design?" Still, somehow many made it through. They learned, fumbled, learned again. Love, affection, and adaptation often developed quietly, like ivy up the side of a conservatory, slow, steady, and stubbornly green despite the chill. And while not every marriage bed was paved with comfort and roses, some, let's be honest, were paved with repression and questionable lingerie. There were those who managed to find connection, even delight, sometimes despite everything. Next, let us drift even deeper into the strange corridors of Victorian marital advice literature. Brace yourself for guides that reference cows and suggested only Wednesday evenings. As ever, we float gently onward, and sitting there in the bluish hush of candlelight, with her corset loosened by a degree or two, and her brand new husband downstairs, poking nervously at a fireplace poker, a Victorian bride on her wedding night may have felt more like she was about to attend a séance than a celebration. Because for many of them, the mysteries of matrimony extended well beyond decor choices and calling cards. There existed around womanhood, particularly young, upper-middle-class womanhood, a genteel but thoroughly unhelpful haze of euphemistic silence. Parents avoided the particulars. Governesses politely redirected the conversation. One might attend a botany course that spent a suspicious amount of time discussing the pollination habits of lilies, but somehow never got around to what ought to have been the main event. Sexual education, as a concept, was like indoor plumbing, often absent, frequently leaky, and only afforded to the very privileged. And even then, it tended to be so heavily coated in moral varnish that all the useful parts got lost entirely. So imagine the mental gymnastics required for a young woman, raised on piano lessons, propriety, and an unflinching loyalty to grape-colored upholstery, to reconcile her upbringing with the next set of expectations foisted upon her as a wife, starting with her wedding night. First came the general dread of disrobing. Victorian fashion being what it was, the process of undressing could easily consume a quarter of an hour and involve items such as button hooks, modesty chemises, and approximately 17 layers of social anxiety. Many of these women had, until this moment, never even seen their own ankles reflected fully in a mirror, let alone anything of greater anatomical import. The poor groom, not that he fared much better, was often scarcely more informed. He might have had a schoolboy's conceptual knowledge and the occasional blushing lecture from a well-meaning uncle. But for many Victorian men, the intimate landscape of matrimony remained decidedly terra incognita. Combine that with layers of mutual embarrassment, limited practical experience, and a lot of uncomfortable furniture, and you have the blueprint for one of the most awkward events in human history, the Victorian honeymoon. Now, to be fair, some brides were gifted a marriage manual beforehand. These little volumes, frequently authored by medical professionals with creatively mustachioed pen names, couch their counsel in florid Victorian prose. Mixed among heartwarming admonitions to cherish and honour one another as companions for life, there would lurk paragraphs on reproduction so vaguely written, they might have been describing the mechanics of a steam engine from memory. You see, the marital congress must proceed with mutual regard and due measure, is not the sort of line that lends itself to actionable advice. And then there was the unspoken spectre of pain. Though Victorian medicine had made a few noble leaps and a few wild stumbles, the understanding of female anatomy was as lopsided as a horse-drawn carriage with a squeaky left wheel. It was widely accepted among many in the medical establishment that women were naturally asexual, their role in intercourse that of passive recipient. This, one might venture to say, did not foster an environment rich in consent or comfort. And so, under soft candlelight and starched marital duty, many new wives endured rather than engaged. For some, it was a gentle unfolding. For others, it was fraught with confusion or distress. And almost universally, it was conducted in a kind of psychological isolation. No friendly group chat to debrief, no sex-positive podcast, no well-meaning aunt to say, "Don't worry, darling, your husband has absolutely no idea what he's doing either." Yet despite all of this, despite the lace-trimmed awkwardness and the rustling dread beneath the sheets, there were also, surely, moments of sweetness. A shared cup of tea in the quiet hours, a nervous laugh, a touching of hands not choreographed by etiquette. Even in a world bound by tight-laced rules, the human heart had a way of peeking through the keyhole. As night deepened and the embers burned lower in the hearth, the house settled into a hush, and upstairs, perhaps two newlyweds, equally bewildered but determined, took one hesitant step into the unknown, armed only with vague metaphors and a strong sense of propriety. And the next morning, with the clinking of teacups and the rustle of servant feet in the hall, began the real education: how to be married in a Victorian world ruled by whisper, etiquette, and a deeply suspicious relationship with pillows. But hush now, keep that thought gently in your mind, just as we flutter toward what awaited them once the wedding dust had settled, and reality, with its many starched handkerchiefs, came calling. After all the lace-trimmed nerves and strategically swooning mothers-in-law, there remained a noble, if baffling, tradition that unsettled many a Victorian bride more than any whispered bedroom tale: the bridal trousseau. Now, this wasn't just a dainty wardrobe. No. This was a full-scale textile onslaught that could topple even the steeliest intentions of becoming a modest, unassuming young wife. The trousseau was not merely a few new dresses and stockings. It was an entire portable linen empire. Cousins were employed, seamstresses underfed, and haberdashers driven to the brink of candlewick madness. In the weeks leading to a wedding, shops would be nearly emptied of satin ribbons and eyelet lace, all to feed the looming hope chest that threatened to swallow the bride along with her sense of individuality. Inside that monstrous carved oak chest were dozens of nightdresses, at least 16 chemises, 11 day caps, which, to be clear, were essentially little lacy bonnets one wore to do absolutely nothing in, and a confounding number of petticoats. A bride without 8 petticoats was, according to Aunt Mildred, likely to slip straight to ruin or rheumatism, both quite unacceptable. And then there was the nightgown, that ever so delicate garment stitched with the care and dread of a nuclear trigger mechanism. Crafted from whisper-thin cotton batiste, or sometimes silk so slippery it gave everyone involved a crisis of decency. The bridal nightgown was a sort of fabric audition for womanhood. It declared, in soft frills and mother-of-pearl buttons, "I am ready, if profoundly nervous." But who was this trousseau really for? Ostensibly for the bride, of course. But let's not pretend. Most of it was actually sewn for the benefit of Aunt Mildred's approval and the housemaid's iron. The Victorian obsession with linen told the world just how virtuous, prepared, and well laundered a young lady truly was. If heaven had gates made of starch, the trousseau was the key. Brides were paraded before trunks packed with precision-folded nerves, each monogrammed hanky a tiny white flag of surrender to domestic destiny. And no, one was not allowed to simply walk down to the shop for a pair of scandalously modern bloomers. Everything had to be handmade, usually by women who hadn't had a good night's sleep since the Crimean War. To add to the pressure, as if picking window treatments and pretending not to panic wasn't quite enough, the trousseau often became a public exhibition. Imagine your underthings, delicately ruffled and primly labelled, spread out across drawing room sofas while neighbours appraised the stitching. Ah, fine broderie anglaise on that camisole, Mrs. Havisham might whisper with reverence, while internally noting that the embroidery moved a touch too close to the risque. And yet, despite it all, the trousseau was a curious comfort to some brides, a tangible preparation when everything else was terrifyingly abstract. It was easier to focus on lace-edge corners than contemplate what, precisely, might happen beneath them, once the wedding breakfast had settled and the guests had finally tottered out into the fog. Of course, no one explained what the nightgowns were actually for. If you'd asked the grooms, most had barely registered them at all beneath the blizzard of social pressure. As for the brides, well, they had been told that the night after a wedding would be transformative, exhilarating, mysterious, perhaps even slightly glow in the dark. Instead, they found themselves folded into a bed so full of lavender sachets it could legally be considered potpourri, smothered in unfamiliar fabric, next to a man who possibly still smelled a bit of mutton from the reception. It was hard to conjure romance when corset laces had left burn marks and your chemise had 14 buttons. All currently lost somewhere in the linen folds of destiny. But then again, the trousseau wasn't exactly romantic. It wasn't supposed to be. It was defensive architecture, part armor, part sobering appetizer for a lifetime of societal performance. Still, when the moonlight fell softly through the gauze curtains on that bewildering first night, and the faint scent of starch hung in the air like a grandmother's warning, the bride would often lie quietly and think not of her husband, but whether she'd forgotten to pack her flannel shift. And with that rather lacy contemplation drifting like soft steam from a hot iron, one can only wonder, what did the husbands make of it all? Well, if you're comfortable, we could turn to them next. As twilight slipped over the lace-curtained parlours and gas-lit drawing rooms of Victorian England, there rustled a seldom-spoken fear among the corseted ranks of young brides-in-waiting. It was not the fear of cold feet or floral arrangements going awry. No, those modern miseries were still decades from gracing anyone's bridezilla diary. Instead, this was the quieter terror, the unknown jungle that was the wedding night. And at the centre of that anxiety, pardon us, while we rustle some muslin, was a peculiar little book called The Wedding Night Explained, in pictures and proverbs for ladies of good breeding. Never heard of it? That's because it barely existed. Most sex education for Victorian women came in the form of cryptic metaphors, anxious whispers, or an awkward chat with a maiden aunt whose professional qualifications were owning a Persian cat and never marrying. In many respectable households, the birds and the bees were not so much discussed as dramatically avoided, like the embarrassing uncle who always drank too much port and mistakenly proposed to the pianist. You might think that a mother, on the eve of her daughter's wedding, would sit her down with candour and compassion, but rather than explaining anything practical, she might hand over a prayer book, a sachet of lavender, and a vague remark like, "Be sweet, but not too sweet." So what did brides actually believe happened on the wedding night? Well, some thought it was a ritual of shared prayers and hand-holding. Others, gathering hints from Greek mythology and Victorian novels, anticipated something wildly romantic, perhaps with flowing robes and recitations of Byron under candlelight. And then, of course, there were those blessed with a little too much imaginative literature. Picture young Miss Edith, bent over her tattered copy of Wuthering Heights, convinced that intimacy involved dramatically flinging open maws and passionate speeches ending in nosebleeds. The poor thing would be quite startled when passion instead involved a pale man in sock garters nervously removing his cravat. But to truly understand the magnitude of marital confusion, we must talk about the ghastly institution that was the wedding night manual. Though rarely printed, occasional guides did appear, written with the subtlety of a foghorn in a chapel, and with titles like Husbandry for the Gentlewoman or Sacred Duties of Mutual Bliss. These tiny tomes tried to wrap up generations of confusion in tepid euphemism. Intercourse was described as the man's conjugal claim, or the wife's delicate offering, which, let's be honest, sounds less like romance and more like making a donation at a church raffle. For many women, the first real clue came not as words, but as trembling gestures from their new husbands, men who, truth be told, were often just as bewildered and emotionally constipated as their spouses. Victorian men had spent their youth at boarding schools learning Latin, fencing, and, very rarely, how to have healthy emotional connections. Their formal courtship involved chaperones, riddles, and the occasional exchange of pressed ferns in a letter. So imagine the scene. Wedding bells faded into memory, dinner guests long departed, and the couple locked together in the mahogany hush of their marital bedroom, her in 14 layers of lace and pins, him perspiring through a waxed moustache, both nervous, both not entirely sure if this was going to be a sacred act or a séance. We mustn't forget the Victorians' staggering fear of physiology. Many women were taught that desire was unfeminine, even dangerous, a sign of moral decay, or, more alarmingly, a symptom of uterine wandering. Yes, the idea that the uterus could literally take a road trip through the body was once medical orthodoxy. So, naturally, women were discouraged from showing too much enthusiasm, lest their wombs pack up and head for the lungs, and thus The wedding night, a tender opportunity for connection, might descend into a stilted affair. A man fumbling through buttons he didn't design. A woman wondering if she should say something, or simply think fair thoughts of Queen Victoria until sunrise. Yet not all was gloom and goosebumps. There were, of course, couples who found their way, who learned to speak a new language of affection in silence and awkwardness, who clumsily learned what no pamphlet dared explain. And in that shy clumsiness, something genuinely touching unfolded. Love growing not in fits of passion, but through shared whispers and mismatched nightgowns. As gas lamps flickered and carriages rattled into the distance, these new brides lay wide-eyed, a little shocked, occasionally appalled, but also, perhaps for the first time, truly magnificently awake to the strange reality of adulthood. But before we turn the page too quickly, there's still the curious matter of the morning after. A day of dubious breakfast trays and side glances from the housemaids. By the flickering candlelight of Victorian parlours, those bastions of floral wallpaper and tightly laced decorum, we now arrive at one of the most curious features of marital miscommunication in the 19th century. The awkwardly ambitious invention known as marriage instruction manuals. Today, we might generously call them books, although many were pamphlets, leaflets, and occasionally letters dressed up in hardback. Their purpose was noble, divinely structured even, to prepare blushing brides and befuddled grooms for the mysterious realm of marriage, while saying as little as humanly possible. These manuals were the court jesters of literature, whispering secrets they barely understood, dressed up in the stiff collar of moral righteousness. Within their pages, shipwrecked metaphors drowned dutifully next to the author's own discomfort. It was as if a collective Victorian consciousness had decided, yes, by all means, let's explain marital intimacy, but do keep everything cloaked in botanical allegory. A typical passage might read something like, "When the Lord blesses the garden with the morning dew, the lily shall open to the firm encouragement of the gardener's hand." Not exactly a how-to guide, more like a riddle wrapped in euphemism, tied with a lace ribbon of confusion. One of the most well-known culprits of this almost helpful literature was a certain Reverend William Acton, a Victorian physician who anxiously assured readers that women felt little to no physical pleasure in the marital act and, conveniently, that this was perfectly normal. The majority of women, happily for them, are not very much troubled with sexual feeling of any kind. So wrote the good Reverend, unmarried, it must be noted, and perhaps unfamiliar with the concept of a pulse. Then there was the poetic but no less perplexing The Wedding Ring, written by Thomas E. Hill, which contains such marvels as, "Man shall not sow wild oats abroad and then gather a harvest at home." A well-meaning sentiment, to be sure, but one that perhaps left many wives squinting at the horizon for oat fields that did not, in fact, exist. Brides clutching these manuals, often gifts from earnest mothers or pious aunts, read their pages with growing concern. The words submission, obedience, and sacred duty appeared far more frequently than comfort, mutual respect, or, heaven forfend, pleasure. Most women, having just learned how to dust chandeliers with a goose feather and embroider moral lessons onto pillowcases, found themselves wholly unprepared for what the wedding night actually entailed. And yet, Victorian men were scarcely better off. While some boarding schools offered a subject grandly titled hygiene, it mostly consisted of warnings against self-abuse and illustrated diagrams of cross-sections of things no one really wanted cross-sectioned. Lovers came to marriage clutching half-truths and holy metaphors praying they didn't wake up their in-laws across the landing. Still, these manuals were prized and passed down, as if words printed in Oxford typeface could transform innocence into wisdom. Some even devoted full chapters to the physics of bedroom furniture, noise reduction strategies, and the spiritual importance of flannel nightwear. Because nothing says romance quite like a biblically sanctioned bed jacket and socks that button to your knees. For some newlyweds, the wedding night ended not in intimacy, but in a sincere, if slightly awkward handshake and the mutual agreement to try again tomorrow or next month. Or perhaps after the next sermon clarified matters a touch. Let's spare a thought for the poor guest room, once a stony refuge for Victorian mothers who insisted on remaining in the marital home until the delicate task of settling in had been adequately supervised and tea had been served in the correct order 3 days running. And amid it all, beneath the trappings of lace curtains, chamomile and clergyman-approved literature, lurked that singular Victorian blend of mystery and terror. Ignorance wrapped in modesty. A society that could churn out medical encyclopedias with 12 pages on the liver could barely bring itself to name the fundamental parts of the human experience, preferring instead to suggest that marital bliss might simply unfold like a Swiss watch if both parties just kept stiff upper lips and read enough psalms. But as the moonlight filtered through embroidered curtains and the fire softened to embers, there sometimes came quiet laughter behind closed doors. Two people, fumbling through metaphor and muscle memory, discovering, despite their training, that love required something more than pamphlets, something like courage and curiosity, and a pair of socks you weren't afraid to take off. As for what happened next, well, a little candlelit wisdom would soon enter the picture, though not the kind found in a trifold leaflet. Instead, something altogether more revealing, and not just in the linen sense. As the carriage clattered away from the church, its wheels all drama, its driver mildly drunk, the Victorian bride was freshly married, breathless, corseted to the edge of survival, and possibly terrified out of her mind. The confetti had yet to settle, and the veil still clung to her hair with a persistence matched only by societal expectation. Her gloved hands trembled, not from excitement, dear listener, but from the dawning realization that very soon she and her husband of 4 hours would be retiring. Ah yes, the wedding night. Now, in our modern minds, a wedding night may inspire a montage of rose petals, tasteful jazz, and two people locking eyes meaningfully before switching off the bedside lamp. In the Victorian imagination, the wedding night was slightly less romantic and significantly more like venturing into a dimly lit realm of the unknown. Specifically, a realm with furniture you didn't understand and activities no one had ever properly explained. Why? Because in this age of candlelit modesty and extremely buttoned-up afternoons, the average upper or middle-class Victorian bride had little to no actual knowledge of the physical intricacies of, how to say it, nuptial completion. Indeed, many were entering married life with not only limited practical experience, but practically no vocabulary to describe what was about to happen. For educational purposes, you might picture the Victorian drawing room, where a young woman might have once asked her mother, "What happens on the wedding night?" Only to be answered with a tight smile, a swift knock on the piano lid, and the pronouncement, "You'll find out soon enough, dear. Mind your posture." Some mothers did try to prepare their daughters. There are letters and journals attesting to awkward pre-wedding chats involving euphemisms like marital duty, lying together, and my personal favourite, coming together in God's sight, which presumably is what one says when trying to encourage an existential crisis in lace-trimmed bloomers. One can hardly blame these mothers, of course. They had themselves been raised in an era where discussing the human body was roughly on par with cursing loudly in the communion line. But the result was generations of brides approaching their wedding night with the vague impression that it somehow involved nightgowns, possibly a prayer, and certainly something unspoken that women were not to enjoy, let alone initiate. Meanwhile, the Victorian groom, equally buttoned, but often better informed thanks to public school law and the occasional dog-eared French novel, had his own set of apprehensions. Gents were told their wives would be fragile, frightened, and entirely dependent on their gentle leadership. Nothing says romance like a series of letters from slightly panicked uncles assuring you that it all comes naturally in the end. Of course, some newlyweds defied the stereotype. Diaries reveal a fraction of happily surprised couples who emerge blinking into the morning light with rosy cheeks and glowing reviews. But for many, the night was a haze of confusion and social anxiety, navigated through layers, literal and figurative, of Victorian modesty. There were corsets to unlace, chemises to lift, and a pervasive sense that one might simultaneously offend God Queen Victoria and one's mother-in-law if done improperly. Complicating matters further were the popular medical beliefs of the time. Some couples were advised by doctors to avoid intimacy altogether for several months following the wedding, lest the lady be overstimulated and suffer a case of mild hysteria, which doctors often treated with questionable machinery and fainting couches. Others were told that marital relations were a sobering duty for procreation alone and should be approached with all the joy of a tax audit. Pleasure, particularly on the part of the wife, was viewed with suspicion, even fear. A woman who enjoyed herself too much might be labelled unnatural, sick, or at the very least, in need of moral correction by way of cold baths and educational pamphlets. And so, tucked between frilly floral sheets in a bed large enough to require its own postal code, many Victorian brides faced the soft creak of mattress springs with trepidation. The room may have been filled with sweet violets and the faint tick of a mantel clock, but the air was thick with questions. How much was she expected to know? How much was she allowed to feel? Was her husband going to be kind? Or simply well-read in terms of Latin etymology and very little else? But in time, marriage would offer its own curriculum. Often slow, sometimes shocking, occasionally sweet. As the last candle flickered and was pinched out, silence took the room. And from that faint hush would rise the first small whispers of married life. A world that was about to get stranger still, especially when relatives started offering unsolicited advice about the art of conception. But hush now. Let's wander gently into that curious realm next. As dusk gently folded its arms around the parlours and drawing rooms of Victorian England, yet another corseted bride sat perched at the edge of an ornate settee, hands clasped, pupils dilated in quiet horror. It was her wedding night, or, as some ladies' magazines of the day might have euphemistically put it, the debut of feminine duty. While you might imagine lace-draped romance drifting in like lavender-scented mist, the reality had more in common with a Gothic novel than a love poem. For many young women, their understanding of the marital bed was a vague cloud of mystery, stitched together from overheard whispers, moralistic tracts, and the occasional, heavily veiled, cautionary tale exchanged in hushed tones over sewing projects. Sex education in proper Victorian households was not so much lacking as it was wrapped head to toe in the same suffocating prudery that smothered most human impulses during the era. Parents might warn their daughters against ruin or impropriety, but they rarely stopped to delineate what precisely they were warning them against. It was as though they believed knowledge itself might be contagious, or worse, titillating. So, when the marriage license was signed and the sugared almonds had been packed away, a young bride often found herself in a satin-trimmed bedroom with only her trembling imagination as a guide. Some brides approached proceedings with curiosity, others with dread, and a few with the steely determination of someone bracing for an unpleasant but inevitable duty, like dental work, only performed by someone you've just promised to love till death. Now, lest we assume all Victorian grooms were debonair scholars of the feminine heart, skilled in delivering both poetry and pleasure, they weren't. Many were exactly as ill-informed and nervous as their new brides. Raised in gentlemen's clubs and cold baths, coached more by bawdy limericks and rumour than by conversation, they too launched into conjugal relations as a kind of blindfolded charade, seasoned with duty and stirred with guesswork. There's a recorded story about one particularly elegant wedding night, where the young newlyweds, not knowing what they were expected to do, climbed into bed fully clothed, bid one another a polite good night, and remained absolutely still in the dark until sunrise. A triumph of Victorian modesty, if not biology. For those who did attempt the mechanics of it all, their aftermath could be, startling. A generation of brides woke the morning after not with romantic sighs, but with vocabulary expanding trauma. Some assumed they'd been injured. Others genuinely thought they might die. One 19th century bridal manual, breathless with euphemisms, offered this soothing passage. Should lady find herself feeling rather overcome after the shared experience of marital introduction, a poultice of lavender and rest may restore her vital energies. A poultice cannot fix everything, as it turns out. It didn't help that the medical establishment was hardly a reliable source of clarity. Victorian doctors, still delightfully baffled by menstruation, hysteria, and the location of certain key anatomical features, often treated female sexuality with a winning cocktail of alarm and disbelief. One doctor cautioned that too much conjugal activity would cause a lady's uterus to roam, like it had packed a tiny carpet bag and set off toward the upper chest. A uterus on walkabout. Add to all this the fashionable belief that women were naturally passionless, and any bride who displayed signs of enjoyment might worry she was, well, unladylike. So brides either steeled themselves for an ordeal, or emerged from the first night of marriage thoroughly confused, slightly wounded, and deeply unsure whether they had just performed their sacred wifely role, or tripped clumsily into a mad world of unspoken rules. Over time, of course, many figured it out. Trial and error, followed by error, more error, and maybe eventually, enlightenment. There's something quietly triumphant about that. As moonlight slipped through the heavy curtains of another gaslit bedroom, the newlyweds lay in uncertain silence. Linen rustled, a mahogany headboard creaked, and somewhere, miles away, an advice column was being cautiously penned by a widow who no longer cared what polite society thought of her metaphors. And so, the mysterious fog of wedding night terror began to clear, candle by candle, in bedrooms, parlours, and secret journals. In the grand symphony of Victorian contradictions, the quiet terror of the wedding night stands as a haunting, hilarious, and oddly human movement. Now, as the grandfather clock ticks oh so civilly toward midnight, let's follow the next thread, through corsets, courtship, and perhaps a little case of marital espionage, wandering now among the candlelit boudoir and lace-draped confusion of upper-class Victorian womanhood, we find ourselves at a peculiar and somewhat embroidered crossroad, the bridal trousseau, a word most modern ears associate with a deluxe cheese board or a forgotten antique shop in Sussex. The trousseau was, in fact, something far more unnerving. Yes, it was a treasure trove of linens, lace, gloves, and embroidered petticoats, but it was also a whispering herald of change, often packed not just with nightgowns and silk corsets, but with quiet dread, wrapped delicately in tissue paper. Picture this: a young bride-to-be, perhaps not yet 20, has spent weeks embroidering her initials on handkerchiefs she doesn't know she'll resent, folding chemises with girlish delight edging into quiet terror, and trying not to wonder why Aunt Mildred gave her a pair of tulip-shaped silver tongs for discretion. The trousseau wasn't just a practical collection of household essentials. It was an insinuation, prettily disguised, that as soon as the last lace doily was packed, her life as a reasonably autonomous human was coming to an abrupt, albeit satin-lined, close. Society, of course, expected her to smile through the entire ordeal. After all, wasn't the trousseau a sign she was lucky, that she was moving elegantly, if somewhat unknowingly, from virginity to virtue, and therefore it was her cheerful duty to sort her cambric nightdresses by length, decorate her hope chest with dried lavender, and not ask too many questions about the intricacies of what was supposed to happen on that nebulous thing called the wedding night. The obvious irony is that while every stitch of the trousseau was newly sewn, practically no new knowledge was ever offered to the bride. Oh no, that would be improper. And so, mothers gave daughters lace pants with extra buttons and said things like, "You'll understand when you're older." All while knowing older meant approximately 6 hours after the wedding supper, when poor Rosalind or Victoria or Eleanor would be tiptoeing into a bedroom with a stranger who, yes, was technically her husband, but also had the wide-eyed enthusiasm of a man who had never seen a woman undress before, and absolutely no manual on how to behave with delicacy. It's important to pause here and note that while modern ears may find this tragic, or even funny, with that peculiar nervous laugh reserved for horror movie characters about to open the wrong door, the trousseau was truly meant with affection. Families poured love into those boxes. Here's your monogrammed hand towel, darling. Here's a tea cozy you might never use, but will inherit nonetheless. Here's a satin-edged robe to make you feel beautiful and slightly confused. Some trousseaux were quite extravagant, especially among the upper crust. There were ladies who didn't just pack slips and dressing gowns, but also opera gloves for their new social status, drawers of cameo brooches, and entire wardrobes meant to impress both mother-in-law and unsuspecting husband. Wealthier brides might even boast a trousseau showing, an almost gladiatorial event where curious aunts and second cousins would gather round and admire the embroidery with a strange mix of envy and nostalgia, pointing out which piece should go under lock and key, as if handkerchiefs were suddenly desirable loot. But a trousseau could be sorrowful too. A working-class bride might have only a few new items, lovingly stitched by hand from well-worn fabrics, the lace second-hand but still precious. These women may not have had satin, but they had meaning. Every trim and ribbon a small act of preparation for the unknown. And perhaps that is the common thread. Whether they came wrapped in silk or neatly folded in brown paper, trousseau were quiet acts of hope. Hope wrapped in apprehension. Hope starched into the corners of pillowcases. Hope with a matching parasol. Still, none of this diminished the very real sense of foreboding felt by countless brides who, having folded and repacked their trousseau for the 5th time, stared out the window wondering what it was exactly that no one would explain. Except, of course, you'll understand when you're older. And it was with that ever-familiar phrase echoing eagerly in their ears that many Victorian brides clasped their trousseau shut and stepped into the unknown, which, as it turns out, often began not in the marital bed, but in the awkward post-ceremony carriage ride, an experience worthy of dreamy examination all on its own. They say timing is everything, and nowhere was that more catastrophically on the nose than in the Victorian wedding night. Imagine, if you will, a young bride with cheeks pink as tea roses and a heart trembling like aspic, because in many cases she was just now realizing what marriage was really about. And you know what didn't help? The absolute tidal wave of euphemism disguised as advice. Victorian maidens tended to arrive at their nuptials with about as much practical knowledge of marital intimacy as a houseplant might bring to a chess match. This wasn't for lack of curiosity, heavens no, but more because society had decided that purity was best and preserved by a good solid wall of silence, ironclad, with Victorian mothers often acting like MI5 agents guarding classified information. Daughters were left to glean lessons about love from sources like sentimental novels, vague poetry, and the odd eyebrow raise from a knowing aunt. Now, after months of delicate embroidery and giddy talk of tea sets and china patterns, the wedding day came. Everything was lace, cake, and polite applause. Then, a carriage, a hotel room, and the slow, dawning horror that actual physical interaction was not merely to be tolerated, but expected. The wedding night breakdown, as some physicians quietly referred to it in private journals, was not uncommon. One poor soul, newly wed and previously quite composed, reportedly leapt from a second-story window in a fit of panic before her bewildered husband, still struggling with a cravat, could make proper introductions. She was unharmed, though quite thoroughly scandalized. But before you pity, the grooms, many of whom were equally unprepared, mind you, pause for a moment and consider the Victorian ideal of male restraint. Passion was a bit uncivilized. A gentleman might express ardor in the purchasing of a scented handkerchief or sighing dramatically near a piano. But otherwise, one was meant to be rather icebergish in emotion, especially among the upper classes, which meant the wedding night turned into a strange little play where no one had quite read the script. Some men, overwhelmed by years of pent-up expectations and worry about virtuous behavior, faltered at the final curtain. And the women, well, let's just say lace corsets and mystery are poor preparation for biology. Meanwhile, the remedy for this awkward tableau was, brace yourself, science, of a sort. Victorian physicians peddled little manuals of marital hygiene, laced with heavy medical Latin and opinions that teetered between the absurd and the alarming. A favorite theme was conservation of vital fluids, which sounds like something one would say about radiator coolant, but was in fact a warning to grooms not to overexert themselves lest they drain their spiritual essence. These warnings were paired alongside advice about airing the bedchamber, avoiding strong cheese, and limiting conjugal visits to once in a blue moon, preferably following lunar cycles and always with the window cracked. As for brides, popular sentiment suggested they were mostly passive participants in the whole affair. In one etiquette guide, it was noted, somewhat grimly, that a bride should, quote, lay back with mild resignation, for ardor is not woman's way. That thump you just heard? That was the sound of 21st century eyebrows rocketing into the stratosphere. But not all was dire awkwardness and molasses-thick etiquette. There is poetry in the way two people, full of nerves and taffeta, fumbled through these rituals and emerged, eventually, with some measure of laughter, if not the first night, then perhaps the second, or the third, or maybe just after discovering the joys of breakfast in bed and not having one's mother within earshot. It must be said that Victorian couples, even those who began these chapters stiff with anxiety and expectation, often softened as time passed. There was comfort in learning together what had been so carefully kept from them. For all the silences placed on youthful curiosity, shared bewilderment, sometimes gave way to tenderness of the most enduring kind. And so, in hotel rooms across the empire, under heavy embroidered bed curtains, and beside nervous but hopeful cups of cocoa, many a young husband and wife began the strange journey from blushing uncertainty towards something resembling intimacy, one misunderstood medical pamphlet at a time. Turn the pillow, dear listener, to the cool side. For as the hour deepens and the gaslights flicker low, we come upon a new corner of this curious corset-bound world where secrecy was silk-wrapped and advice could be just as perilous as passion itself. As the evening lamps flickered low behind lace-curtained windows, all across Victorian England, a most peculiar hush would fall upon the drawing rooms of newlywed homes. After the final piece of wedding cake had been politely picked at, after Aunt Margaret had dabbed at her tears and Uncle Cyril had declared the punch strong as Nelson's navy, there came a most nerve-tickling moment. The farewell. Some called it retiring. Others more dramatically called it the crossing of the threshold. But whatever euphemism one applied, the truth was this. After smiling serenely through a nap-inducing 3-hour sermon on marital duty, a very anxious bride and her equally clueless groom were about to be left alone, unsupervised, in a room with a bed. Now, one might naturally assume that these couples had at least a foggy understanding of what came next. But no. For many Victorian brides, the wedding night was not only mysterious, it was the social equivalent of attempting to assemble furniture without instructions, using only nervous blushes and years of intentionally incomplete metaphors. Sex education, you see, was not so much an institution as it was a shimmering mirage on the horizon, visible only if you squinted hard enough or had a scandalous aunt who vacationed in France. Girls were expected to arrive at womanhood with all the mystique of a porcelain figurine, exquisitely beautiful, unfathomably delicate, and preferably silent. And so, the wedding night loomed large. There were whispers, of course, cousins who'd married off and returned with tight-lipped expressions and vague remarks about adjustments. Mothers might, on the eve of the wedding, hand their daughters a tattered handbook on conjugal union, penned by a clergyman in 1833, containing such helpful phrases as the marital bloom of the moonlit encounter. Naturally, brides lay awake wondering what precisely would bloom, and where, and whether moonlight had anything to do with it. Grooms were not always better off, mind you. Victorian gentlemen were, in theory, meant to possess a refined self-control bordering on saintliness. Any prior experience with the carnal side of life was expected to be either non-existent or obtained discreetly in parts of continental Europe, never mentioned in polite company. A man who arrived at his wedding night with a twinkle in his eye and a pamphlet from Paris was likely viewed as suspiciously modern, or worse, French. The result? 2 humans sitting on the edge of the bed, smiling awkwardly, possibly discussing whether the fire needed another log. while simultaneously experiencing heart rates more common in long-distance runners. It's worth noting that some families, in an effort to prepare their daughters, did offer a formal talk. This conversation, however, was typically composed of vague references to a woman's duty, interspersed with metaphors involving gardens, bees, and the occasional sailing ship for reasons no one could quite explain. There's even record of an aristocratic mother telling her daughter not to worry because your husband will do what he must. Just close your eyes and think of the empire. Not exactly the stuff of romance novels. Still, amid all the confusion, not every wedding night ended in disaster. Some couples laughed their way through the awkwardness. Others postponed the ordeal entirely and spent the evening playing whist with cousins or writing thank you notes for the 5 identical crystal salad bowls they'd received as wedding gifts. And on the rare occasion, a newlywed pair might simply decide to talk. Stripped of social expectations, corsets, and antiquated anatomy diagrams, they'd find themselves human, funny, tender, shyly ambitious humans, and they'd begin, in their own quiet way, to forge intimacy, though no one could have explained to them that that's what they were doing. Wrapped in heavy linen sheets, under the watchful gaze of an oil portrait of someone's frowning great-uncle, they might hold hands in the quiet. Falling into sleep before duty could become drama, and discovering, quite subversively, that love wasn't always what the pamphlet said it would be. But then again, when you've spent a lifetime being told that your most important future role was to become both a devoted wife and a silent marble statue, even just saying, "I'm scared," or "Can we talk a bit longer?" was its own small revolution. Some nights, the scariest thing wasn't what might happen, but what might not happen. And some nights, simply surviving the lace-trimmed anticipation was the bravest thing a bride could do. Now, the candles are guttering low. The fire has shrunk to amber embers, and somewhere down the hall, the house cat has settled itself precisely on someone's wedding veil. Let's tread quietly onward, into softer shadows, where unwelcome advice may tiptoe away, and a few unexpected truths are about to come calling. Perhaps with a calling card. As the clock ticked softly in the hall and gaslight flickered like sleepy fireflies along velvet wallpaper, an entirely different kind of drama unfolded behind the drawn lace curtains of the Victorian bridal chamber. A drama without music, costumes of questionable practicality, and an astonishing lack of useful direction. You see, for many blushing brides of the 19th century, having survived the pageantry of the wedding day, the miles of satin, the mystery of the finger sandwiches, the existential dread woven into every stitch of their bloomers, there awaited yet another much quieter ordeal. The wedding night, a candlelit performance for two, in which one party might be enthusiastically over-prepared and the other profoundly uninformed. Not to put too fine a point on it, Victorian women had no official user manual for what was to come. For some, the sum total of their wedding night education consisted of a last-minute, panic-muttered euphemism from a married aunt who squeezed their shoulder and whispered something like, "Just lie back and think of the empire." And so they did. Lie back, that is. Often in corsets, because undressing fully was considered alarmingly immodest. There were whispered stories in parlour corners about wives who had never seen their husbands completely unclothed, and possibly vice versa. Modesty, decorum, and layers of linen managed to turn the marital bed into something that more closely resembled a historical reenactment of two ghosts trying to haunt the same bedsheet. Ironically, Queen Victoria herself, for whom an entire era was named, was, well, quite the fan of marital enthusiasm. Her diary entries dashingly doodled around words like ecstasy and bliss, coupled with gushing praise for Prince Albert's royal contributions. But the Queen's bedroom, candour never trickled down to the parlours of middle-class morality. People admired her devotion, but preferred not to ask, devoted to what, exactly? Among the so-called proper classes, it was widely believed that a virtuous woman should avoid any hint of desire. It wasn't just discouraged, it was considered vaguely medical, even dangerous. Early 19th century texts solemnly warned that too much feminine pleasure could cause hysteria, fainting, or worse, opinions. These were strange times indeed, full of contradictions in bustles and top hats. Doctors, some bearing impressively mutton-chopped confidence, preached differing theories on sexual health. A few warned that marital relations should be limited to prevent spiritual depletion. One likened it to giving away your vital essence like a careless squirrel misplacing acorns. Another claimed that even married couples should refrain entirely during the full moon. One can only imagine the awkward silences in lunar almanac households. Meanwhile, the young wife, trembling slightly in her lace-trimmed nightgown, might be lying in a four-poster bed the size of a horse-drawn carriage, waiting for her husband, who might be finishing his point-by-point reading of The Husband's Duty, as prescribed by Reverend Watsit, which advised gentle firmness, spiritual leadership, and blankets folded modestly between the newly yoked souls. Of course, not every Victorian bride was quite so innocent. Some had servant gossip to rely upon, maids who spoke in hushed, scandalous circles around the drying racks. Some had well-meaning cousins who smuggled French novels into embroidery kits, and a few defiant souls skulking in libraries discovered medical diagrams on actual paper, which didn't help much unless you enjoyed squinting at startling woodcuts detailing the reproductive system in cross-section, labelled in Latin. Still, despite all the fear and secrecy, there were stories, tucked into diaries, hinted in letters, of women who found their way, who weren't especially terrified at all, who figured things out gently, awkwardly, quietly, like any couple fumbling toward closeness. With time, tea, and perhaps a subtle suggestion that bloomers were not, in fact, legally required in one's own bedroom. And what about the husbands in this whole affair? Some were as nervously curious as their brides. Others carried confidence, courtesy of ancient boys' schools and questionable novels. A few likely got their education from gossipy stable boys who claimed an alarming amount about Paris. And perhaps, just perhaps, one or two were kind enough to listen, notice trembling hands, and keep to a pace set, not by custom but by care. And so, with the moonlight soft against plaster ceilings, the heavy damask drawn against the night, and a world of whispered guesses lingering between two uncertain souls, the wedding night ended not with fireworks, but with a sigh, a beginning not of drama, but of mutual bewilderment wrapped in embroidered flannel. But tomorrow, tomorrow would bring its own revelations, much quieter, far less terrifying ones. And so, with lace trailing from the foot of the bed and the gaslight dimming to a flicker, let us drift gently into what came next. The oil lamp flickers low. The fire has settled into a quiet bed of embers, and the bustle of the Victorian day has finally hushed into gentle, murmuring stillness. After weeks of embroidery, etiquette rehearsals, and anxious fittings in a corset so tight it might as well have been a security system, the Victorian bride is finally, in her new marital bed. Or rather, she's sitting politely atop it, very upright, nightgown buttoned to the neck, fingers folded like a nervous governess awaiting inspection. Across the room, her husband is engaged in a curious dance with his own pajamas, folding and unfolding them with anxious devotion, as though frightened they might bite. One might assume in our modern sensibilities that the wedding night of a Victorian couple was a consummation ablaze with passion. But this was not so much candlelit romance as it was nervously lit confusion. Think fewer roses and more, rattling nerves and awkward lengthy silences, broken only by the occasional ill-timed stomach gurgle. You see, Victorian society had built an impressive fortress of taboo around the marital act. It had handed young women a teacup full of metaphors, communion of bodies, the marital duty, and, troublingly often, the ordeal, and then tightened the lid with a doily of decency. It was like preparing one for war by handing them a paper fan and a strong sense of modesty. Most brides hadn't the faintest idea what they were expected to do once all had said, "I do," eaten the salmon mousse, clinked the sherry glasses, and waved farewell to Aunt Edna, who'd already knitted 4 babies into existence in her mind. Some were vaguely aware that something will happen, preferably involving holding hands and lying very still. Sex education, if it arrived, came courtesy of whispering older sisters, confusing hygiene pamphlets, or horrifyingly vague warnings from mothers involving horses, complicated feelings, and a belief that the sight of a wrist could send a man into dangerous spirals. And yet, for all this drapery of secrecy, the entire institution was brimming with implications. Advice books fluttered with delicate talk of wifely submission and natural inclination, while some even warned that too much excitement on the wedding night could lead to, well, female mania. Yes, too much passion could supposedly prompt sudden piano outbursts or, heaven forbid, unladylike opinions. Not to be outdone, some grooms arrived at the conjugal threshold also woefully unprepared. Raised in equally prudish conditions, they stood with trembling moustaches and vague heroic notions, having absorbed more from sailors' boasts and classical statues than any meaningful lesson. For many, the wedding night felt less like a celebration of love and more like a pop quiz they hadn't studied for, without pants. And so, you had 2 thoroughly bewildered people in a room full of flower petals and high expectations, trying to navigate the most intimate human act, while mentally reviewing etiquette primers and praying that no one fainted. Some couples, bless their buttoned-up little hearts, spent their wedding night making small talk. Others played cards. One diary entry, a treasured gem of Victorian candour, describes a couple choosing to read aloud from Milton together until they both fell asleep, fully dressed and immeasurably relieved. But over time, things softened. With patience, proximity, and perhaps a few accidental giggles under the covers, love often bloomed in spite of society's stiff crinolines. Letters reveal long marriages ruled more by genuine affection than social duty. Husbands who grew playful. Wives who began to ask questions. Silent guesses turning into gentle conversations. In the end, perhaps the real Victorian honeymoon wasn't a grand escape to snowy Paris or rainy Bath, but the slow, careful discovery that the person you'd married had quirks, kindness, and an unexpectedly endearing snore. So now, with all veils lifted, candles flickering low, and the muffled tick of a grandfather clock keeping polite rhythm in the hallway, we let the worried bride and her equally anxious groom drift into their uncertain bliss, holding hands under 5 layers of bedclothes, not entirely sure what comes next, but rather glad not to be alone. And as for you, dear listener, tucked into your own modern bed with no corset in sight and a wealth of knowledge Victorian brides would envy. Let sleep find you the way it didn't quite find them that night. Gently, curiously, without pressure or panic. Tomorrow will come as it always does. Corsets optional, understanding greater. But for now, close your eyes and rest. The secrets for tonight have all been told.